today that we wanted to dig in just a little bit more to try to peel back some of the layers here. So Minnesota is really in the bullseye right now for a potential federal lawsuit because it will not comply with President Trump's executive order to keep biological males out of girls and women's sports and violations of Title IX. Yesterday, you may have seen U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi took the podium and she filed a lawsuit against Maine for the same reason and actually said during that same press conference, Minnesota, essentially, you're next. So joining me now is Twin Cities criminal defense attorney Joe Tamburino, well-versed in Title IX litigation, among many other things. Joe, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me on, Amy.
Sure. So a lot of layers here. If we can kind of break it down, starting with this basic question of if the state of Minnesota gets sued by the federal government in a case like this, what does that look like? You know, what would be at stake?
Well, there's a lot at stake because right now the state of Minnesota receives approximately $2.2 billion in federal aid to our schools. That's more than 10% of our budget. So think of it this way. If the federal government withdrew that, it would mean that approximately 3 million taxpayers in Minnesota would have to pay basically an extra $750 a year in perpetuity until we get the funds back. So a lot is at stake.
Okay, so let's step back if we could, because I think when the DOJ started investigating the Minnesota State High School League back in February, we were able to do just a little bit more digging into what is at the heart of the issue here. Among other things, it looks like there's a language difference between the federal law and our state law here in Minnesota when it comes to sort of the definition of transgender, whether it's Minnesota saying it's identifying as someone who's transgender, or the federal law, which, correct me if I'm wrong, looks at the biology here, the biological piece of this. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's pretty close to it because there are two issues. One is the federal law, which is called Title IX. It's from a very large educational bill that was passed in the Nixon administration in 1972. And that governs basically the equal treatment of genders in sports and many other things. But what we're concerned about here is sports. And it has been unclear as to whether or not Title IX, being specific to the sexes, would include gender identity as being a sex, meaning that does Title IX say if you consider yourself a female, even though you are biologically a male, does that mean you get to participate in women's sports? So that's the unclear part. That's going to work itself through the courts. But then we have the second layer. The second layer is the Minnesota Human Rights Act. And what that says is that you can't, a school basically, discriminate on the basis of gender identity. However, the Minnesota Human Rights Act does have exceptions. And one of the exceptions is that you can have separate sports for separate sexes. So the issue becomes, under the Minnesota Human Rights Act, is gender identity a sex itself, or do they go by biological sex?
How do we get to a resolution on that? You're saying on the one hand, it looks like it would work its way through the courts, but so how do we come to a more clarity on that particular definition?
It will have to go through the courts. And right now, what should happen is some type of a negotiation. Because what we see happening, and we saw this in the United Kingdom with their recent decision by their Supreme Court, 5 justices all unanimously decided that when it comes to participation in sports or organizations that have separate sexes, male and female, you have to go by the biology, not just simply how someone identifies. And there's an argument to that in the Minnesota Human Rights Act, because in the Minnesota Human Rights Act, it clearly states that gender identity is how someone identifies themselves. They can identify as a male, a female, or none of the above. They can identify as not in a particular sex. But the Minnesota Human Rights Act also talks about sex in terms of biological sex, such as if you have sports teams like in high school and you want to have the male baseball program and the female baseball program. So that's how it's going to have to play through the system. But there's so much money on the line that really, instead of our state leaders, Attorney General Ellison and Governor Walz, going immediately on lawsuits or some type of attack, they should be trying to negotiate this with the federal authorities, because we don't want to lose $2.2 billion in federal aid.
Negotiation. It just doesn't seem like a word that is in our vernacular right now when it comes to these polarizing issues, particularly this one. Do you feel like that needs to be the solution here, the only solution to get there?
At this point, yes, because why can't a state like Minnesota negotiate with the federal government and say, before we go into lawsuits, before we have any type of withdrawal of federal funds, let's see how the courts are playing in other states. Let's see what happens in Maine. Let's see what happens in other legal challenges, because we might get an answer to this, say, within the next year. So if we could negotiate and somehow forestall any type of withdrawal of federal funds, without any type of lawsuits, that would be very beneficial. If not, and if we don't comply with the federal demands, then we're going to lose $2.2 billion. And mind you, much of that funding goes to students who really need the help, students who are challenged not only economically, but also socially, mentally. It goes to very needy students.
Yeah. I've heard this question asked quite a bit, and forgive me because I'm trying to keep this very baseline, because I've asked this question myself, which is, you have the federal law and you have the state law, and it's not as simple as, well, the federal law supersedes the state law, or the state law would override the federal. Is that even an issue here?
It is an issue, and federal law overrides state law. So, for instance, Amy, if all of a sudden some federal courts, say an appellate court or the U.S. Supreme Court itself, said that under Title IX, the determining factor is a person's biological sex, meaning if you have XX chromosome, you are a female. If you have XY chromosome, you are a male, and not about identity. Well, that's going to be the law of the land. And then that's going to do an easy answer for all the states, which means you're going to have to go along with the Trump administration. So if some federal court of appeals or U.S. Supreme Court comes out and finally says under Title IX, the law that's been around since 1972, you have to go by biological sex, that answers all the questions. Then it's clear, because you could not have a state law say something other than that.
And that's what happened in the UK, correct?
Exactly. And now the United Kingdom has a different system than we do. What happened in the United Kingdom is certain parties in Scotland, which obviously is part of the United Kingdom, got this case to the Supreme Court, 5 justices in the UK, 88-page decision unanimously. And what it basically came down to is that they are going to define sex as your biological sex for certain programs, including such as sports activities.
Okay. In your experience, can you kind of walk me through, you criminal defense attorney, but you have defended, girls and women, who believe that their Title IX rights were violated. Is that accurate?
I have worked in Title IX in the educational area, not in the sports area, in the educational area where people have felt that they have been sexually discriminated against, as well as people who have been accused of sexual discrimination.
Okay. And so I guess when we look at, defending, girls and women in that space, what would sort of the chances be of someone who was a biological male, leveraging some sort of a lawsuit in this space? I mean, or is it still so gray and complicated and unclear that was that a client that you would take on, for instance?
Right now, I think that would be a difficult position, because what the state or what the school district say would probably argue is that under the Minnesota Human Rights Act, they have an exception for women and men's sports, meaning you can discriminate on the basis of biological sex, which is different than gender identity. When you identify as someone of the other sex, or under the law, you can identify as being neither sex, which is completely permissible, you shouldn't be discriminated against, and it's illegal to be discriminated against. However, there are certain exceptions, and sports activities, it's going to be argued, is one of those exceptions. So I think it would be a difficult case to litigate.
Okay. This is super helpful to kind of clarify, especially around the ideas of gender identity and biological gender, because that seems to be kind of where we keep colliding here. When you say that this will work itself through the courts, I mean, how long are we talking? Because I can't imagine that's going to be quick.
Usually it's not quick, but in today's world, we have seen, especially the U.S. Supreme Court, act quickly on some issues. So, if they decide, the federal court system, the appellate system, through all the circuits, as well as the U.S. Supreme Court, that this is something that needs to be decided quickly. Why? Because there are all these lawsuits across the nation concerning the administration in states. And so rather than have, 50 states fight 50 different lawsuits, let's get to the bottom of what Title IX means. Because as we just discussed, if the federal courts, if the U.S. Supreme Court interprets Title IX to be, just like in the UK, biological sex, well, then all the questions have answers.
Yeah.
Then states such as Minnesota or any other states could continue to have separate sexes for separate teams.
Okay, wow, such a complicated issue, such an emotionally charged issue for so many people as well, understandably on both sides. And so we appreciate you kind of taking some time to help us parse out some of the definitions here and just looking at it through a legal lens. And so if I'm hearing you, just to kind of wrap up, if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like, if you were in a position to give advice to, the state of Minnesota, it would be look for ways to negotiate this, to just, somebody's going to be happy and sad, somebody's going to be happy and sad over here, but we gotta try to get to that place.
That's right. I would try negotiations first. Why? Because there's so much on the line. If we lose $2.2 billion in funding, that's more than 10% of our education budget. That's significant. And the only way to make up for that would be, quite frankly, tax increases. Also, you'd have to think about all the money that would be spent on protracted litigation. Litigation not only with the Attorney General's office, but what happens if they needed further help and hired private law firms. That's extremely expensive for the taxpayers to pay. So negotiation, you got to do that first, regardless of what party you are with or what party is in power in Washington.
Did you ever, in your career, as you've, as this issue has evolved, did you ever foresee that we would be in this place with Title IX?
No, because quite frankly, all the Title IX work that involves men's and women's sports has always been trying to get greater funding, greater activity with women's sports. It's basically, think about this. In 1972, this was a landmark bill, landmark law, because what it was trying to do was give equality to the sexes. And what we saw in the later 70s, and especially in the 1980s and 90s, was that women had a chance to litigate, to get into court, to say, look, we have men's sports getting all this funding. We want women's to be on par. And it's been very successful. It's been a very successful law to help women's programs. But no, I did not foresee the transgender issue where you would have all of this litigation. And it's litigation involving, quite frankly, a small amount of people. It's not like this is something that has hundreds or thousands of people that are involved. It's quite small.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That was going to be my final point. So, Joe Tamburino, thank you so much for your time today and your insight into what is a very complex issue. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on.
Okay, take care.